7 states share the Colorado River: Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico in the mountains where the river is born, and Nevada, Arizona, and California in the deserts below where most of the people live. Between them, this single river waters some 40 million people, grows much of the nation's vegetables, powers cities, and makes the modern American West possible. And here is the quiet, uncomfortable truth that binds all 7 of them together, the truth this story is about. None of them have enough water. Not one. Every single one of these 7 states is now drawing on, or laying claim to, more water than the river can actually provide. And the most unsettling part is not the shortage itself. It is that all of them know it. The scientists know it, the water managers know it, the governors know it. They have the models, the forecasts, the measurements. The shortage is not a surprise waiting to happen. It is a fact they live with, and mostly refuse to say out loud. This is the story of a river that was promised to too many, a truth that everyone shares and no one wants to speak, and a reckoning that 7 states have spent 100 years postponing. To understand how 7 states ended up sharing a river that cannot satisfy any of them, you have to go back to the original mistake, made a century ago, that everything since has been built upon. In 1922, representatives of these states gathered to divide the Colorado River among themselves, to decide who got how much before the great dams and canals were even built. It was a monumental act of planning, and it contained a fatal flaw that doomed everything to follow. They divided the river based on how much water they believed it carried, and they made their measurements during an unusually wet stretch of years. They assumed the river reliably delivered around 16 or 17 million acre-feet of water annually, and they split that generous imaginary total among the basins, promising each half a large, fixed share, with more later guaranteed to Mexico. But the river was never that generous. Over the long run, its actual flow has averaged far less, closer to 14 million acre-feet. And in the drought-stricken years since 2000, it has delivered only around 12. In other words, the founders of the modern West sat down and divided up water that did not exist. They wrote each state a check drawn on an account that was always overdrawn, and every state has been fighting over that phantom water ever since. What makes the mistake so tragic is that it was not obvious at the time, and for decades it did not seem like a mistake at all. The early 20th century, when the measurements were taken, genuinely was wetter than the long-term norm, so the negotiators were not being reckless by the standards of what they could see. They simply could not know that they were measuring the river at a high point, mistaking an unusually generous era for the ordinary state of things. As the decades passed and better records revealed the river was smaller than assumed, the legal allocations did not shrink to match. The paper numbers were locked in as sacred entitlements, while the river delivered less and less. So the gap between what was promised and what exists did not close. It widened. Each new dry decade made the original overallocation look more absurd, yet the promises remained fixed, because no state was willing to accept that its share had been imaginary all along. The founders' honest error hardened over a century into a refusal to face the arithmetic. This is the root of why none of them have enough. The paper promises add up to more river than nature provides. If every state took exactly what it was legally allocated, the demand would exceed the supply by a wide margin, even in a normal year. Engineers have a cold name for this permanent imbalance, the structural deficit. It means the system is designed to take out more than comes in, to run backwards, to drain its reserves a little more every year regardless of the weather. For most of the 20th century, that deficit was hidden, papered over by wet years, and by the enormous reservoirs the states built to store the surplus. Lake Mead and Lake Powell, the 2 largest in the country. Those reservoirs were the buffer that let everyone pretend the arithmetic worked. But a buffer only lasts until it is spent, and after a quarter century of drought and overuse, both great reservoirs have fallen to around a quarter of their capacity, near the lowest levels ever recorded. The cushion that hid the shortage is nearly gone. And the phantom water the states were promised is being exposed for what it always was, a promise the river could never keep. Now the 7 states are not all short in the same way, and understanding the 2 halves of the basin is the key to understanding why they cannot agree. The river is split into an upper basin and a lower basin, and the two live with the shortage very differently. The upper basin states, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico, are where the river is born, fed by the snow that falls on the Rocky Mountains. They sit at the top of the system, and their supply is whatever the mountains happen to provide in a given year. They have never actually used their full legal share of the river, because they have a legal obligation to send a set amount of water downstream to the states below them every year, no matter how dry it gets. So the upper basin states feel their shortage as a ceiling they can never reach, a portion of water that is theirs on paper but that they cannot safely develop, because in dry years, meeting the downstream obligation eats into it. They are shorted by nature and by the rules, forced to leave water on the table that they were told they owned. The lower basin states, Nevada, Arizona, and California, feel the shortage in the opposite way. They sit at the bottom of the system, receiving water released from the reservoirs upstream, and for decades, they used every drop of their allocation and more, because the reservoirs made it possible. But now the reservoirs are emptying, and the lower basin is where the structural deficit lives most visibly, losing over 1 million acre-feet a year to evaporation and the sheer cost of moving water across the desert, on top of the overuse. The lower basin has been living beyond its means for years, and the reckoning is arriving as mandatory cuts, the first in history, that fall unevenly across these 3 states. So the upper basin is short because it can never use what it was promised, and the lower basin is short because it has been using more than exists. Same river, same shortage, opposite experiences, and that difference is exactly why the 7 states have been unable to agree on who should give up water. Consider Arizona, which sits in the most painful position of all. To win federal funding to build the Great Canal that carries river water across the state to Phoenix and Tucson, Arizona agreed decades ago to hold the most junior rights in the lower basin, meaning it is first in line to be cut when shortages come. And the cuts have come. Arizona has already absorbed the deepest reductions of any state, falling largely on its farmers, who have watched their river water dwindle toward nothing and fallowed their fields or drilled desperately for groundwater instead. Arizona knows, with absolute clarity, that it does not have enough, because it is already living the loss. Its own government has found that the groundwater beneath its fastest-growing suburbs cannot support all the development already planned, and the state has had to freeze some new construction. Arizona is the state where the shortage has stopped being theoretical, where everyone can see it in the dry canals of Pinal County and the paused subdivisions on the edge of Phoenix. And still, the metropolis keeps growing. Consider Nevada, which holds the smallest share of any state, a tiny sliver of the river, and yet is almost entirely dependent on it, because Las Vegas draws nearly all of its water from Lake Mead. Nevada knows it does not have enough so acutely that it has become the most aggressive conservationist on the river, banning decorative lawns, paying people to tear out grass, recycling almost every drop used indoors, and drilling a deep new intake so it can keep drawing from Lake Mead even as the reservoir falls toward levels its neighbors cannot reach. Nevada has done more with less than anyone, precisely because it understood earliest and most viscerally that its water was running short. It is proof that these states know, because Nevada has spent enormous effort and money acting on that knowledge, even as it keeps building and growing in one of the driest places on the continent. Consider California, which holds the most senior rights on the lower river and is the single largest user of Colorado water. On paper, California is the best protected, legally last to be cut, and it leans on that seniority in every negotiation. But even California does not have enough, because much of its Colorado water flows to the Imperial Valley, a farming region that grows a huge share of the nation's winter vegetables and is now under intense pressure to give up water to prop up the failing reservoirs, when Imperial Valley farmers conserve. The runoff that fed a nearby lake dries up, exposing toxic dust that sickens the surrounding communities. So even the most powerful state on the river, the one with the strongest hand, is caught in the same trap, forced to choose between the water and the harm that saving it creates. California knows its abundance is borrowed, that its senior rights are only as good as a river that keeps shrinking beneath them, and consider the upper basin states, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico, whose bind is quieter but just as real. Colorado is where most of the river's water originates, born as snow in its mountains, and yet as an upper basin state bound to deliver water downstream. It could be forced to cut its own use to keep that promise when the reservoirs run low. The state that grows the river could be told to take less of it. Utah has grand plans to draw more water in the future to fuel its rapid growth, plans that assume a river that no longer exists at the size those plans require. Wyoming and New Mexico, arid and sparsely populated, hold shares they have never fully used and now may never be able to. All four know that the water they were promised at the top of the system was calculated from the same phantom total as everyone else's, and that their share too is written on an overdrawn account. They are short in advance, denied a future they were told they could build. So there it is. 7 states, and not one of them has enough. The Upper Basin cannot use what it was promised. The Lower Basin has been using more than exists. Arizona is already being cut, Nevada is already rationing, California is already trapped, and the mountain states are already denied their paper future. Every one of them is short, in its own particular way, and the shortage is not coming. It is here. And the second half of the title is the part that should truly haunt us. All of them know it. This is not a case of ignorance, of a slow crisis creeping up on people who do not understand it. The science is settled and shared. Every state has access to the same models, the same reservoir gauges, the same forecasts showing the water dropping year after year. The water managers of all 7 states sit in the same rooms, look at the same charts, and speak, in private, with remarkable honesty about the deficit they all face. There is no serious dispute about the facts. The knowledge is universal. And yet, knowing is not the same as acting, and this is the deepest tragedy of the Colorado River. Because while all 7 states share the knowledge, each one also has a powerful incentive to protect its own share and make the other states give up theirs. If cuts must be made, and everyone agrees they must, then each state fights to ensure the cuts fall on someone else. The Upper Basin argues it should not be forced to give up water it never got to use in the first place. The Lower Basin argues the pain must be shared by everyone. California points to its senior rights. Arizona points to how much it has already sacrificed. Each position is reasonable from inside that state, and together they add up to paralysis. It is the oldest problem in human affairs, the tragedy of the commons, where a shared resource is destroyed because every individual user, acting in their own rational self-interest, refuses to be the one who sacrifices. All 7 states know the river cannot sustain them all. Not one of them wants to be the first to give up the water that their economy, their farms, and their growth depend on. And there is a brutal logic that makes the paralysis even worse, because each state can see that if it sacrifices water voluntarily while the others do not, it simply hands its neighbors the very water it gave up. Conserving becomes not just a loss, but a gift to your rivals. A farmer in one state who follows a field to leave water in the reservoir may watch that saved water flow to a competing farm or a rival city in another state that made no such sacrifice. So even a state that genuinely wants to do the right thing hesitates, because unilateral virtue on a shared river can feel like unilateral disarmament. Everyone waits for a binding, enforceable agreement that guarantees the pain will be shared, and everyone distrusts that such an agreement will hold. Layer on top of this the tribal nations with their own senior and often unmet claims, and Mexico with its treaty share, and the negotiation becomes a knot of competing interests so tangled that pulling any single thread tightens all the others. The knowledge is universal, but the structure of the problem punishes whoever moves first, and so, for years, almost no one has. This is why, despite decades of warnings and universal awareness, the 7 states have repeatedly failed to agree on a plan to live within the river's real limits. The set of rules governing how the river is shared is expiring, and the states have been locked in tents. Sometimes bitter negotiations over what replaces it, missing deadline after deadline. The federal government has warned that if the states cannot agree among themselves, it will impose a solution on them, one that none of them may like. So the 7 states now face a choice they have avoided for a century. They can finally sit down and agree, as adults, on how to share a smaller river, deciding together who gives up what, cushioning the blow, and planning for a drier future. Or they can keep fighting, keep protecting their own phantom shares, and have a solution forced upon them by drought, by a federal pen, or by an empty reservoir. The knowledge that binds them has never been enough, on its own, to make them act. The question is whether the crisis finally will. There is a particular kind of dishonesty that runs through all of this, and it is worth naming, because it explains why the public so often does not grasp how serious the situation is. The officials of these states know the shortage intimately, but they speak about it, in public, in the softened language of growth and resilience and innovation. They reassure their citizens that no one who has water will lose it, that the state is not running out, even as their own models show the deficit stretching decades into the future. The reason is not simple deceit. It is that the entire economy of the modern West, the real estate, the construction, the agriculture, the endless expansion of the desert cities, depends on the belief that there is enough water. To say the shortage plainly, loudly, in a way that lands, is to threaten the growth machine that funds these states. So they know, and they do not say, and the gap between private knowledge and public reassurance is where the crisis quietly deepens, unaddressed, year after year. Step back, and the situation of the 7 states is almost a parable for how human societies handle slow catastrophes. The problem is understood. The data is clear and shared by everyone. The solutions, though painful, are known, use dramatically less water, especially in agriculture, which consumes the overwhelming majority of it, pay farmers to fallow fields, tear out thirsty lawns, and strike a durable agreement to live within the river's true flow. None of this is a mystery. What is missing is not knowledge, but will. The collective willingness to accept a shared sacrifice before the alternative is forced upon everyone. 7 states, all aware, all short, all hoping someone else will move first. It is a mirror held up to every large, shared challenge humanity faces, where knowing the truth turns out to be the easy part, and acting on it together turns out to be the thing we cannot seem to do. And yet the story is not hopeless, and it is important to end there, because despair is as paralyzing as denial. The very fact that all 7 states share the knowledge means the foundation for a solution already exists. No one has to be convinced the crisis is real. They all already believe it. The reservoirs, though low, are not empty. The tools to bring the river back into balance exist and are proven. Nevada has shown that deep conservation is possible. The states have negotiated hard agreements before, in earlier crises, and pulled back from the brink. What the moment demands is that the same knowledge they all privately hold finally be matched by a shared, public willingness to act, to share the loss rather than fight over it, to treat the river as the single, finite thing it is, rather than 7 separate claims on an infinite one. So this is where the 7 states stand. They share a river that cannot satisfy any of them. Each is short in its own way. The mountain states denied their future, and the desert states cut in the present. The reservoirs that hid the shortage are nearly spent. The rules that govern the sharing are expiring, and the phantom water promised a century ago is finally being called in. And through it all runs the strangest and most defining fact of the whole crisis, that there is no ignorance here, no one who does not understand. All of them know. They have always known. The Colorado River will not be saved by discovering some hidden truth, because the truth is already sitting on every water manager's desk in all 7 states. It will only be saved, if it is saved at all, when the people who share it stop pretending they do not know what they know, and finally act, together, on the truth they have all been carrying alone. Because in the end, the river does not care about paper or promises or the seniority of anyone's rights. It carries the water the snow and the sky provide, no more and no less. And it has been carrying less for a generation now. The states can argue about who owns the phantom water for another decade, but the argument changes nothing about the volume actually flowing between the canyon walls. That number is set by the climate, not the courts, and the climate is trending toward a hotter, drier basin and a smaller river, which means the gap between what the states claim and what the river gives will only grow. There is no version of the future where the old promises are honored in full, because the water to honor them is not there and is not coming back. The only real choice is whether 7 states divide a shrinking reality by agreement or by collapse. They all know which would be wiser. Whether they can finally act on what they know is the last open question on the Colorado, and the river is not waiting for an answer.